Thanks for joining me on episode 338 of the Inspired Stewardship Podcast.
I'm Kristen.
And I'm Jeff.
From Small Biz Life Podcast. If your calling is to be a small business owner, we challenge you to grow yourself and find your true identity so you can be empowered to live your calling.
One way to be inspired to do that is to listen to this, the Inspired Stewardship Podcast, with our friend Scott.
An article online or something else that could have helped them, or maybe you've listened to a podcast episode like one of mine and you've thought to yourself, oh, that's something I really need to try. But then by the time you get home, you've forgotten that information. You haven't actually executed and put it into your life. You haven't made it a habit. You haven't made it something that you want to do and you're able to do.
Welcome and thank you for joining us on the Inspired Stewardship Podcast. If you truly desire to become the person who God wants you to be, then you must learn to use your time, your talent, and your treasures for your true calling. In the Inspired Stewardship Podcast, you will learn to invest in yourself, invest in others, and develop your influence so that you can impact the world.
In today's episode about investing in yourself by stewarding your time, I talk with you about why reading is a great thing to do, but why reading by itself isn't enough. And yet, many of us just don't read enough.
As we talk about stewarding your time, wouldn't it be great if you could support this podcast and do it without just taking too long? Turns out you can't. All you have to do is use inspiredstewardship.com/Amazon when you're ready to make a purchase via Amazon, and a small commission will come back to support the show just that quick. If you enjoy the show when you are ready to buy from Amazon, just use inspiredstewardship.com/Amazon.
One thing that a lot of times people stop doing once they graduate from high school or college or even postgraduate work is reading. And when I'm talking about reading here, I'm not just talking about reading for pleasure. I'm talking about reading for growth, reading to learn something new about business or about marketing or to learn some new skill. To read a nonfiction book is something that's actually rare in today's society. Most adults have not read a single nonfiction book since they graduated from high school or college, or at least I've seen statistics that suggest that that's true. But the truth is that reading is a powerful way to learn. And don't get me wrong, I know that not everybody likes to actually sit down and read a book, but audiobooks is just as good, or almost as good at least, as actually sitting down and reading the book, listening to the book. And obviously, I'm doing a podcast. I am in favor of learning through auditory means like podcasting and others, and audiobooks is part of that. Reading is part of that. It's part of what you have to do to grow. If you think about it, when you find nonfiction books, whether those are biographies or business books or other books like that, you are availing yourself of some of the best thoughts of people on the planet. It's basically like you're getting a virtual mentor who is able to sit down across the table from you and share their ideas about a specific area or specific technique or a topic or about their life. It's basically like availing yourself of their information and their learning without actually having to trace the person down and have a sit down with them. That's what a book allows you to do. So reading is obviously a great thing to do, something I'm a huge proponent of. You heard me on the interview with Bob talking about reading multiple books a year, and last year I'd cut it down to 12. Previous years I'd been reading anywhere from 50 to 56 books a year. And this year I upped it a little bit from 12, and I'm trying to read about 24 books, about 2 books a month. Still less than my old numbers of 52, but increasing a little bit of my learning. I'm just being a little more targeted about what I'm trying to learn. But the key is I'm still reading because I want to still grow. I want to learn new techniques. I want to learn new things about business and about marketing and these sorts of things. But that kind of gets us to the second point. And if you remember the conversation with Bob on Monday, one of the things I talked about was how I'd cut back on reading because I wanted to focus more on implementation. See, reading by itself isn't really enough to invest in yourself. Think to yourself how often you yourself or someone you know has read something, an article online or something else that could have helped them, or maybe you've listened to a podcast episode like one of mine and you've thought to yourself, oh, that's something I really need to try. But then by the time you get home, you've forgotten that information. You haven't actually executed and put it into your life. You haven't made it a habit. You haven't made it something that you want to do and you're able to do. See, reading by itself doesn't actually make anything happen. It can begin to open up your thoughts. It begin to open up your mind. You can begin to learn a new skill, but you really can't master it until you begin to apply that skill, until you begin to put that skill into use and out into the world, because that's what actually allows you to grow further. Reading by itself isn't enough. Reading by itself doesn't cause the growth. Reading by itself just begins the process. It's not the ending of the process. It's not the ending of the journey. But at the same time, one of the things that happens is most of us don't actually read enough. We don't do enough to continue learning and growing and investing in ourselves. Stop and think, how many books have you read in the last year? In fact, let me know. Send me an email, send me a comment, send me a Facebook message, send me a Twitter message, and let me know how many books have you read in the last year. I'd be curious if the listeners of my show read more than the average person. I would hope that that's true, but I simply don't know because I've never asked. But most of us just don't read enough. We don't read to learn. We don't read to grow. If it's true that most Americans haven't read a nonfiction book since they graduated from high school, then how could people continue to grow and learn through reading if they're just not doing it? So what I want you to do is to think about this. What are some specific things that you need to learn about so that you can begin to grow further? Name 2 or 3 things that you really need to master in this coming year. And when you do that, then go out and find 1 or 2 books on each of those topics and put them on your calendar to have them read by the end of this calendar year. You should be able to finish 3 to 4 books by the end of this year, either through listening to them or through reading them with the old-fashioned paper book that you sit down and open, or reading it electronically on a Kindle or a computer. And I challenge you to read at least 2 books about each of those specific topics that you want to grow on by the end of this calendar year. Thanks for listening.
Thanks so much for listening to the Inspired Stewardship Podcast. As a subscriber and listener, we challenge you to not just sit back and passively listen, but act on what you've heard and find a way to live your calling. If you like this episode on the stewardship of time, be sure to sign up for our Stewardship of Time Tips series by going to inspiredstewardship.com/time or texting 44222 Time Tips, and that'll get you our best tips on stewarding your time. Until next time, invest your time, your talent, and your treasures. Develop your influence and impact the world.